Welcome back, everyone. This is Landscape of Destruction Part 2, A New Birth of Freedom. And not only does this follow then on the heels of Landscape of Destruction Part 1, it also accompanies the other video for this week, an analysis of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So we're going to set up the context for the Gettysburg Address here using this lecture, and then you can go on to that video to watch more specifically an analysis of that famous speech itself. Maybe the easiest way to set this up is to suggest that the Gettysburg Address was Lincoln's effort, Abraham Lincoln's effort, to capture for the nation the deeper meaning of the Civil War. Nearly 8,000 American soldiers had died at the Battle of Gettysburg, that famous battle in July of 1863. In fact, still to this day, the largest military battle ever fought on the western hemisphere of our globe. More than 150,000 troops, both north and south, met at Gettysburg, a place of destiny, you might say. Recall, it's in southern Pennsylvania, which means it's not even on southern territory. It was the second time that General Robert E. Lee had brought his army north of the Mason-Dixon line, trying to create some decisive victory that might convince the Union to quit the war. And this, the second of his two offensives, this time into southern Pennsylvania, the college town of Gettysburg, would become, in many respects, a turning point of the war. Not for the reasons that Lee had hoped, of course. The Confederacy will suffer a defeat at Gettysburg, but because it would never again be the case that the Southern troops would fight on Northern soil. The casualties of the war were so great that Lincoln would be tasked now with helping to oversee the construction of a battlefield cemetery there. And it was in November then, on November 19th, that he would return to Gettysburg to deliver the famous address. Now, to appreciate all this, we have to go back for a minute to the beginning of the war, back to 1861. You see, our view of the war, I think, in our own time, and this is the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, our own view of the war these days and for generations really has been clouded over by what historians would call, I think, a nostalgia or maybe romanticism, that as we look back at the Civil War, we tend to focus on those elements that we still celebrate in some measure, the great battles, the great commanders. And in doing so, we have managed, I've argued elsewhere in my on-ground class, for example, we've managed to kind of cloud the original sort of understanding of the war as it was commonly understood by the people at the time. And this cartoon, I think, captures that original understanding. It's from Harper's Weekly magazine, showing three parties. On the left here, the southern representative of the southern half, the right, the northern half, and in the middle, a slave, a character representing a slave, who's ripping the map of the country in half, suggesting the editorial comment here is that really at the center of the conflict between North and South, at the center of that conflict was slavery. In other words, the disagreement over slavery was in fact at the heart of the conflict. And as I say, we've at times lost sight of that, I think, as we've tried to couch the conflict in more contemporary political concerns of our own day to be an argument over federal governmental power or argument over states' rights. I mean, in some measure, those concerns played in, but really, as contemporaries understood it, was a fundamental disagreement over slavery. Americans at that time had a clear view, after all, of slavery's political connections. Here's a map from 1860, a census, federal census map, showing in the darkened areas, the concentrations, the highest concentrations of slavery, of slaveholding, that is the population of enslaved people at that time. And it's entirely, of course, the southern part of the United States, from Texas to Florida to Virginia, and even the border states of Kentucky and Tennessee and Missouri, but the highest concentrations belonging to what we'd call the Deep South. There was no question in the minds of Americans in 1861, when the war begins, that slavery was a Southern institution, and in that sense divided the country in terms of demographics, economy, race, etc. Now, when Lincoln was first inaugurated in 1861, he was anxious to convince the nation, but particularly the southern part of the nation, the anxious, themselves anxious Southerners, that he had no intention to interfere with their rights as slave owners. There had been, I think, a commonly held belief among many, particularly Southerners, that Lincoln, being a member of the Republican Party, was somehow committed to the abolition of slavery. Well, he wasn't an abolitionist, and he made clear in his inauguration that, and I'm looking down here near the bottom, he says, "I have no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." So he spelled it out as clearly as he could that the South had no reason to fear from his presidency that their slaveholding would be somehow interfered with, that their rights, their property rights as slave owners, would be somehow abolished. And yet, by the time he gave this speech, 7 states from the South had already seceded and were forming what we know as the Confederate States of America, or otherwise known as the Confederacy. Well, if that was the case at the beginning of the war, if slavery was somehow at the center, despite Lincoln's efforts to convince or reassure Southerners that he would not in any way attempt to abolish slavery, 2 years later the war had imposed an entirely new meaning on things. That is, the actual war itself, the military conflict, had imposed a new meaning on the war overall. And this picture helps us understand why. These are freedmen, as they were then being called, that is, former slaves who were now living outside of slavery in the army camps, the Union Army camps, and areas beyond their plantations. This particular photograph shows a group of African American ex-slaves in Virginia in 1862, an area of Virginia controlled by the Union Army, who had been declared by the United States Army, or the Union Army, to be, quote, contrabands of war, which meant that as former possessions of the enemy, they had been confiscated by the U.S. Army, the Union Army. In truth, what they had done is they had run away. They had escaped, using war as cover to seek their freedom. Now, this put it upon the Union to deal with essentially a growing crisis of war management. So many slaves were escaping in the war theater that Union commanders had little choice but to provide them with basic necessities of food and shelter, but increasingly to prevail upon the Union to somehow put them to work, to allow them to be cooks and launderers, and to provide for basic material necessities. And of course, it wasn't long before they would also, these Union commanders, be requesting of the government that they be allowed to use the menfolk, at least among them, as soldiers in the army. And this was something that Lincoln resisted for a time due to political reasons, but which he came to believe by 1862 was perhaps necessary to fortify the Union Army in its effort to put down the Southern Rebellion, as he called it. In other words, as thousands of able-bodied male slaves, now former slaves, declared to be contraband of war, represented a terrific potential for manpower in the military battle, the military contest with the South. And so moving in that direction was now the North. That is a direction toward recognizing the destruction of slavery as somehow tied up in the war aims not just putting down a rebellion, but solving the fate of the slaves as well. And one Northerner who recognized this, Lydia Maria Child, a Northern resident and acknowledged author and abolitionist, said, "We are drifting," meaning we in the United States, we in the North in particular, we are drifting. I cannot see where, but we are drifting somewhere, and our fate, whatever it may be, is bound up with these contrabands. So, yeah, acknowledging that slaves and slavery and the abolition of slavery perhaps was somehow tied up with the overall issue of the war. It was in recognition of this that Lincoln would prepare his famous Emancipation Proclamation, which was scheduled to take effect on January 1st of 1863. His proclamation during wartime, issued that is during wartime, that all slaves in the areas still under Confederate control were, quote, "are and henceforth shall be free." Are and henceforth shall be free. Now this is a curious proclamation because if you look at the map here, you can see the free states contrasted with the Confederate states, that is the slaveholding states here with the pattern, the lined pattern, and the so-called border states, which are darkened here. Now, those border states also held slaves, but they were not part of the Confederacy. So Lincoln holds off from declaring slaves emancipated in those border states because he doesn't want to lose them to the Confederacy. It was a sensitive issue. He didn't want the politicians in those states of Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, etc., to declare for the Confederacy. So he excluded them and said instead that only the slaves living in the Confederate territories were now to be deemed free. But of course that begged the question because Lincoln, as president, did not any longer have authority over those Confederate states in practical fact, and so nothing he would say or decree would in effect be applicable to those Confederate states. Now it would seem to be futile, in other words, to declare slaves in those territories free when those territories, those states, those Confederate states no longer acknowledged you as a sovereign. But there was a kind of idea here, and the idea was that these Confederate states, according to Lincoln, then in rebellion, would eventually, that rebellion be put down and would have to come back into the Union. At that point, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation would take practical effect, and they would no longer be slaveholding states. In other words, just as the Union military, the Union Army would win victories over the Confederacy, over every inch of soil that the Union Army reclaimed, slaves living there would then be declared free. So the Union Army, in effect, was no longer just an army putting down a rebellion. It was an army liberating slaves. Well, the Battle of Gettysburg took place 6 months later, that is after the Emancipation Proclamation, and about 5 months after that, 4 or 5 months after that, in November of 1863, the cemetery, the National Cemetery, which had been constructed to inter the fallen soldiers at Gettysburg, that dedication ceremony now was ready to go forward. You see the photograph here on the left showing an actual real-time photograph, you might say, from November 19th of the crowd, estimated to number around 15,000. This photograph on the right, a remarkable photograph. It's the only one that shows President Lincoln attending that day. He in the center of the picture here without his familiar stovepipe hat. You can kind of see his forehead. He's looking down. That's because he's sitting back down. He's already delivered the address. This is his bodyguard, Ward Layman, seated next to him, and other dignitaries and people assembled on the speaker's stand. Due to the limitations of photography at that time, it took about a good 3 minutes to capture an image on the camera. The negative, that is a glass plate negative used in the cameras at the time, the photographer hadn't really even been able to position himself and to capture an image of Lincoln speaking. The shutter didn't click. The image wasn't captured until the president had sat back down, which reminds us that the famous, maybe most famous speech in American history, the Gettysburg Address, lasted all of about 3 minutes. Though we should be fooled by its brevity into thinking it was an unimportant speech, we've already suggested that is not the case. And the speech, as we know it, with some of the key language red lettered here, would not only help frame the meaning of the war, but really sort of frame the subsequent history of our nation ever since. And so I'm going to have you watch the video also under content for this week, where I break down the speech. It's about a 28-minute video breaking down the speech analytically to capture that critical meaning, that significance that will help us frame our subject for the remainder of our semester. So that's all for now. When you have an opportunity, follow up with that third video on Lincoln's Gettysburg Address.